Precious Memories is a Japanese language-only trading card game released back in 2010 and still chugging along as of 2022. Conceptually, it's very similar to Wise Schwartz, in that instead of its own original world and characters, all of its cards featured characters and events from various anime series. However, while Wise Schwartz has plenty of translation resources and makes actual English releases, Peritune has never been released in English, and there's overall very little info about the game in English at all. In terms of gameplay, it's also quite different from Wise Schwartz. So, how do you play the game? Peritune decks are 60 cards, and some decks, especially more modern decks, are able to use a 15-card extra deck on top of that. Both decks can feature no more than 4 copies of the same card, which all sounds pretty standard, but in this game, there's a couple extra layers that can be a little confusing. As an example, take a look at these 2 cards. Right here is the name. In this case, the card on the left is Misaka Mikoto, and the card on the right is also named Misaka Mikoto. However, these are technically different cards, and you could include 4 of each of them in the same deck, despite the fact that they have the same name. Unlike virtually every other trading card game on the face of the planet, Peritune doesn't differentiate their cards by name. In order to determine uniqueness, and hence which cards you're able to have 4 of in the same deck, you actually have to check the code at the bottom of the card. If you're thinking this could be a bit annoying during gameplay, well, it is. Unlike Wise Schwartz, which gives you nicknames for each card in the card name, in Peritune you're basically left to come up with your own nicknames when referring to the field. So you have Undressing Mikoto, Zappy Mikoto, Swimsuit Mikoto, Other Swimsuit Mikoto. It's a bit of a weird decision. As you set up to play, mulligans are very simple. If you don't like your first hand of 7 cards, you can put it on the bottom of your deck in any order and draw 7 new cards. And then if you don't like your hand, you're stuck with it because mulligans are done at this point. Gameplay progresses through several phases, which should be pretty comfortably familiar to anyone who has played a TCG in the past. You begin with a beginning phase. This is where you ready any of your resting cards, so resting to ready. That's basically untapping if you've played Magic the Gathering or any other similar games, and then you move into your draw for the turn. In Precious Memories, you're drawing 2 cards per turn, although, like many other games, the player that takes the first move only draws 1 card on their first turn. They take a draw penalty on that first draw, just to compensate for the fact that they get to take the first move of the game. From there, you move into a main phase, which is when you play out cards from your hand. Cards are broadly divided into 3 main types. There is character cards. These are going to be your main units of the game. Characters come in a few different flavors. Most of them are going to have some form of AP and DP, that's their approach power and defense power, which is used in combat. However, some do not have this, and they're still perfectly functional character cards. However, you can't place them in the main area. They are only able to be placed in the support area, which is further back. So be aware when you're placing cards, make sure that they actually have an approach power and defense power if you're planning on approaching or defending with them. Beyond that, there's also combi characters. These are cards where there is more than 1 character on the card at once. Most cards in the game are only going to feature 1 character like this. However, this card over here is a combi card which features both Mikoto and Kuroko. So that has a few additional effects as well. Most importantly, they count as having both of those card names. However, in order to play it, if you're paying a cost, you have to make sure that one of the cards you're using to pay the cost matches that character. We'll get into that a little bit more when we get to actually playing these cards out. The other major categories of card types you need to be thinking about are events, which are sideways oriented. These are basically just spells from other games. You play them, apply their effect, and then they are discarded immediately afterwards. And then there are also supports, not to be confused with support characters, which are the ones that do not have an approach value and defense value. I don't know why there's 2 card types that are both called supports, but here we are. Supports that are actually labeled as such in their card type are cards that are like equipment in other games. You attach them to a specific character and it gives that character a boost. Those are the main card types, and they are all played in much the same way. In order to play out cards from your hand in Put a Memo, what you have to do is pay attention to the cost and then the source. Source is used to pay for costs, which seems pretty straightforward. In order to play a card, you have to discard the cost of that character in source from your hand. So if we want to play this 2 cost card, we need to discard 2 source from our hand. In this case, we will discard this support card. So we've discarded that. We can put that into play. We are going to put it right here in our main zone. Remember, there are 2 zones, a main zone used for units that are able to approach and defend, and a support zone, which is further back here, which you can put characters with approach and defense values, but you can also just place cards without them. There's no limit to the number of support cards you can have, but there is a strict limit of 5 cards in your main area. So we'll put this here. Now, one thing to note is that this card has the active keyword, which means that it can approach on the very turn you play it. Normally there is a summoning sickness rule, like in Magic the Gathering, where cards can't approach the turn they're played. Active cards get around this. However, the way active works in Precious Memories is that this doesn't apply on the first turn of the game. So, despite this having active, there's not really a whole heck of a lot we can do with her right now. For the rest of this, we are just going to fill out the rest of our field. We will play out this Misaka and Kuroko. It has an effect when it comes into play. You choose one of your characters in play, then you can discard 1 card in your hand to search out a support character with cost 0 with the same name as that designated character and put it into your support area. So we will discard 1 card from our hand, and since we have a Misaka in 2 separate spots, we will just grab another Misaka from our deck and place it into our support area. Note that this is one of the cards that does not have an approach value or a defense value, therefore it counts as a support character. Now, we still have plenty of cards in our hand, which means we could keep playing cards out. However, at this point, we are just going to stop here for the turn. Oftentimes, despite the fact that Put a Memo lets you play out every card in your hand in the first turn, because of how the effects work and because of how you want to be sequencing out your plays, oftentimes you just want to create a solid field out front and then pass and keep a little bit in the tank for the next few turns. So it'll be the opponent's turn. They will draw 2, and our opponent can start filling in their own field. Now, this last card that they've played is notable for 2 reasons. First, it has active, and since it's not the first turn of the game, it is able to attack immediately, which lets us get into combat works. However, another somewhat interesting factor of this card is that it has 0 defense points. Combat in this game works very similarly to Magic the Gathering with its power and toughness system. However, the one big exception to that can potentially throw off players coming in from Magic the Gathering is that cards are not automatically defeated for having 0 defense points. They only are defeated when they actually get in combat with a unit that actually does have an approach value. So we will see how combat works in this game because our opponent is going to approach. They only have 1 unit that they can approach with because they've only got 1 active unit. So they will approach us here. Now, we can block with one of our units by tapping it, or we can simply let the damage come through and hit us in the face, which we might as well do so we can see how damage works in this game. So, since we have not defended this attack, it's going to damage us, and in order to do that, we just flip over the top card of our deck and put it into our point zone here. The first player to hit 7 points is the loser, and naturally, the first player to get their opponent to 7 points is the winner. Now we'll move back over to our turn, and we'll see a little bit about how the rest of the turn plays out. So we're going to draw 2 cards from our deck. We'll play out this Misaka, which makes the next Misaka or Kuroko we play cost 3 less, which means that this card is now free. We can play out another Misaka. This one, when it comes into play, we look at the top 5 cards of our deck and can add a Misaka to our hand. So we'll add a Misaka to our hand and put the rest on the bottom of the deck. Next up, with that Misaka that we just added to our hand, we're going to level up one of our characters. Level Up is a keyword ability found on certain cards that allows you to place them over top of another character with the same name. Notably, it has to be exactly the same name. You can't level up over here because this is a combi card, which is both Mikoto and Kuroko. But this is only a Mikoto on her own, and her stats are a little bit lackluster, so we're going to level up on top of her. Leveling up has a few advantages. The first level up you do of a turn on each character is always going to be free. If we wanted to place another level up card on top of this, we can, but we'd actually have to pay the cost for that. This first level up, because it's the first one we're doing on this character, is actually free. There is no cost involved. Furthermore, once you've leveled up, the leveled up card gets plus 10 approach power and plus 10 defense power for every card underneath it. And since we also leveled up, the leveled up ability triggers here. In this case, it gives the card active and plus 20 until the end of the turn. Next up, to get our attack ready to go, we're going to rest this support character. It has the ability to give one of our Mikoto Misakas plus 20. So now we'll move into the third phase of the turn, which is our combat step, and we'll go into that in just a little bit more detail. We already got to see how the opponent worked, so we will move into our attack here. And now the opponent is actually going to defend our attack. Remember, we took the damage to our face last time. The opponent doesn't particularly feel like taking the damage to their face, so they are going to defend. To defend, you rest your character, which means that obviously any card that has attacked cannot defend because you've already rested it. But if you have an unrested card, you can rest it, and then the two cards battle each other, much like Magic the Gathering. So they apply their approach power to the defense power of the opponent as damage, and then any card that has enough damage marked on it to exceed the defense value is then discarded. In this case, these are both 30/30s, so they both take each other out. So they are discarded like that. Next up, since this is active, we will attack with our leveled up Mikoto here, who currently is sitting at 60 power. The opponent doesn't much feel like trading off their card, so they're just going to take that point of damage. Next up, we'll attack here, and remember, since this has been boosted by our support character, it's sitting at 50 approach power and 50 defense power. Once again, the opponent would be throwing this card over here under the bus, so they are not going to do that, and they're just going to take a second point. Now our opponent is at 2 points of damage to our 1 point of damage. This card over here is still, it was just played this turn. It's, again, this is the word from another card game, but it is still summoning sick, so it's not able to attack, so we're just going to pass our turn over here. The last step of the turn is the end step, and like most other card games, not a whole heck of a lot happens here. After that, the turn is over, and once again, the opponent gets to move into their turn. They'll draw 2 cards, restand their units, and they will play out a bunch of characters from their hand, draw a card from their support Ueharu's ability, and use the ability of their support Ruiko. This lets them apply a plus 20 boost to 2 Satin Ruikos that they have on their field already. So they've powered up their attack force a little bit, and they will just attack with them. I'll attack here. Again, this is a 50-50. We only have a 30-30 back here on defense, so we'll just take a point of damage. And for this second attack, though, the opponent is sitting pretty with 60 approach power. However, they only have 20 defense power, so we will block here, and they will take each other out. We'll apply 30 damage over here, and they'll apply 60 damage here. In both cases, that's enough to defeat these characters, so they are both defeated. That done, once again, we'll move into our turn. Ready our resting units, draw 2. And the last thing I'll get into before I start talking less about how to play and more about the game in a more general sense, is that you are able to use cards over here in your point zone to play for cards out of your hand. You can actually use these cards for their source value. In order to do that, you just turn them face down. So we have a source 1 card here and a source 2 card here. So we'll turn them both face down in order to play out this Kuroko from our hand. Next up, we will pay 1 card of source in order to play out this Kuroko. We'll level it up here. We can choose 2 of our opponent's characters to get -20, -20 for the turn. So we'll apply that to their 2 Uiharus and make their defenses very, very poor. And we'll move into our own attack step after, again, using our support card to give this Misaka a boost. So we'll attack here as a 40-40 because of the card underneath it as a level. The opponent will take that as a point of damage. Now, this card actually has an ability when it is placed into the point zone. Some cards have this either with the keyword break or just as ability text, but they can have various effects when they are put into your point zone after taking a hit from an approach. In this case, you look at the top 5 cards of your deck and add a Uiharu from among them to your hand and put the rest on the bottom. So they've found a Uiharu and added that card to their hand, which will give them a little bit of a boost going forward. Next up, we'll make a second attack here. And once again, we're attacking with a 50-50, and they only have 2 10-10s to defend with. Notably, even if these cards had their full power value, double blocking is not a thing in this game. For example, if this were Magic the Gathering, they'd be able to block with both of these cards here, and assuming they had their full power again, they've been shrunk with Kuroko over here, but if they had their full power, they'd be able to apply 60 damage over here, and we'd only be able to take out one of them by applying our 50 damage to either one or the other. In this game, however, you're not able to do that. You're not able to double block. You can only defend with one card at once, and the opponent has decided that they don't particularly want to do that. None of these cards aren't particularly powerful on their own. Again, they're both only 30-30s. However, they have Uiharu back here, who's able to rest to give 2 Uiharu units +20/+20. So they'll just choose to take another point here. So there's been a good exchange of damage back and forth. We've gone over all of the major mechanics of the game. So I'll just let the rest of this game play out while I talk a little bit more about the game in a more general sense and what my thoughts on it are. So, if that is how the game plays out, is it worth trying to get into if you're an English-only peasant? Short answer is no, probably not. There's a few reasons for this. First up, on the level of the game's basic rule system, there's a few points that just don't quite come together. The resource mechanic is actually pretty interesting. It gives you a huge amount of freedom right from the first turn of the game, and is relatively simple and easy to understand. Players coming in from Magic the Gathering will also appreciate that there's no way of getting screwed or flooded. You'll always have the resources to play cards, and the real gameplay is going to come down to how you allocate them. The problem with giving players that much freedom from the first turn of the game is that it can also create a ton of lag right at the very first turn of the game due to decision paralysis. This might sound like a problem that'll only affect newer players, but even watching more experienced players play out games, the first turn of the game still takes a ton of time. You need to figure out not only which cards to pitch as resources, which cards to actually play, and which cards to sandbag for future turns, but you also have to figure out how to sequence all of that. There are cards that will reduce the cost of cards played after them, and other bonuses that apply to cards later on in the turn. All of this is also coming from a significantly larger than normal hand size. I've mentioned in one of my theory videos, but most games tend to stick to a starting hand of 4 to 5 cards. Even Magic the Gathering and Pokemon, with their starting hand size of 7, fit into this rule once you remove the resource cards, which are very simple in their function and work the same in nearly every deck. Flesh and Blood uses a somewhat similar concept of pitching cards in hand to use as resources, but it makes it work with a hand size of only 4. If the start of the game can lag a bit, given the long amount of time spent sequencing and playing out your starting hand, other mechanics can make the rest of the game feel like a bit of a slog as well. Probably the biggest culprit here is the decision to port over the worst part of Magic the Gathering, its combat system. And for the record, yes, I do think that Magic the Gathering's combat system is a worse offender than land cards. This style of attackers and blockers gives a huge advantage to the defending player. The attacker must commit first, and the defender is able to choose how to match up the fights. Which ultimately means that combat for the defender is always going to involve the best possible matchups of cards in play, while the attacker must always deal with the worst possible matchups. This leads to a game that will naturally lend itself to board stalls, and the limited field size of Precious Memories only exacerbates this, since it eliminates go wide as a strategy to break stalls. Well, both of these points are somewhat strong criticisms. As a game that's been around for over 10 years, there's been ample opportunity to address these shortcomings in the rules with well-crafted card abilities. And although the game apparently has some issues with power creep, it does play pretty well. The depth of play is available right from the start of the game, feels a bit like Yu-Gi-Oh! But with a more developed resource system, vastly better ability formatting, and a slower and more strategic combat system, which all does sound pretty good. So why am I very much not recommending this to English players? Well, in addition to the two structural problems I've mentioned in the game's design, there are two other big problems for an English-only player. First, there's a pretty significant lack of content. Translations are patchy, and most fan sites appear to not be currently active. You might be able to find a good translation of your favorite series, and Railgun's translations that I found were quite robust, but you might also end up with only a skeletal translation at best, or, at absolute worst, you might have no translations at all. Beyond that, the game encourages a large diversity of cards in decks, partially due to the larger than normal deck size relative to other Japanese trading card games at least, and partially because the amount of card draw and filtering, which allows for a large number of tech inclusions and silver bullets, and also partially because each character card functions like a legendary creature in Magic the Gathering, and that you can't have more than one of the same card in play at once. Combined, these factors all mean that each deck is going to have a ton of unique cards within it, which can be extremely daunting to create card inserts for, or to dig through for on translation sheets. For some context, this Railgun deck I've been using is between 3 to 4 times the number of unique cards as the average Wacross or Duel Masters starter deck. It makes this game's problems with decision paralysis ultimately much, much worse, since you're constantly trying to remember what each card does in addition to figuring out how to sequence all of the plays. There are ultimately some ways around this, such as with paper inserts, which can be a bit messy and a lot of work to pull together, or by playing on an online simulator which has a more seamless translation interface, but again, support for online sims ranges from patchy to non-existent. One alternative, if this game's resource system interests you, might be the Final Fantasy TCG. I haven't had a chance to play it yet, but the resource system it uses is very similar, and it actually has been released in English. Flesh and Blood also uses a somewhat similar resource system, and is just a genuinely interesting game if you're somewhat competitive and are some kind of Philistine who doesn't demand anime waifus in all of your card games. This game's resource system and combat does give it a tempo that feels fairly unique. No other game lets you spew off quite so much in the first turn of the game. And this starter deck gameplay doesn't really do justice to the absurd amount of card draw available in more tuned competitive lists. The number of draw 2 effects players pass through in the average turn is honestly mind-blowing. To an extent, the game almost needs its slow, ponderous combat system and limited field of play just to rein in the pace. Precious Memories, at the end of the day, is not my favorite trading card game, but in spite of the issues with the core mechanics, its effect design and overall gameplay was still really intriguing. Honestly, if the size of the card lists I ended up with weren't so daunting, I'd be tempted to build a few decks for the game just to keep around as a battle box. If you've played the game either as an English fan or as someone who can actually read the cards and perhaps has more insights into the gameplay, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Either way, have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.